Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford. We are here for the seventh and final part in a 7-part series as we linger in the Bardo with George Saunders' novel, Lincoln in the Bardo. So what do we do on a review? Well, we've got 3 good things, 3 bad things, quotes, literary breakdown, a rating, and a recommendation based on the text. So we're going to start with the 3 good things. Number 1 on the list of good things about this novel, time frame. This novel takes place in a single night, and what that does is it condenses the story and it prevents meandering. It is simple and it is direct. There is much to be said for a novel that attacks one time frame and does not meander all that much. There are some flashbacks, of course. There is some contextualization from literary sources. This is a novel that, when we actually think about it, does take part from... I'm trying to think of the earliest part of this novel, the at least 10 years before the novel's actual setting, all the way through modern times, because it does involve quotes from texts based on Lincoln in today's world. But the story part of this happens in a single night. And that is something which really can benefit a novel. Number 2, Saunders' voice is vivid and active through most of this novel, the obvious exceptions being those pieces of other texts which were nabbed by Saunders and incorporated into his book. The third good thing about this book is it is unpredictable. If you have been with the channel through the entire series on this book, I was notably wrong in the first 3 episodes, I think, of this series in assuming that we were going to have Abraham coming to the Bardo and leaving with his son. We do not get that. This being in relative close proximity of Abraham's life to the end of Abraham's life. So I thought that that would make an incredibly interesting novel or conclusion to the novel, and would have maybe given us, we'll get into that later, maybe would have given us an actual moment with our main characters and some neat little bow and ribbon on a novel that, instead of having a bow, just had the ribbon, but it wasn't tied in a knot. It was just sort of sprawled across the table. Now, 3 bad things. Number 1, the time frame. As I mentioned, yeah, it would have been nice to see Lincoln show up in the Bardo as a spirit, not just as Lincoln the fella, not just as Lincoln the Nightcrawler. So I think that in certain ways, the time frame of this novel was limiting. Number 2, I have to do it. I just have to. I can't get away from it. George Saunders and the idea of masculinity simply do not mesh. There's a lot of soy in that boy, I guess. Anytime, and I say this as someone who really enjoys reading George Saunders. I say this as someone who has read probably 70% of his short stories, as well as obviously now the one novel. As someone who has sought out interviews with the guy, I really enjoy George Saunders. But when he tries to write a character that is masculine, the way that transcribes itself onto the page is loud and or violent. George Saunders is someone who writes a lot of gender-neutral type characters, which is fine when you go out into the world. Is basically what you're running into. You're not running into a lot of people who are ultra-masculine or ultra-feminine. But when he tries to get into that realm, he really sort of just writes a caricature. He writes a character like the lieutenant, who is loud and violent, and really that's it, just loud and violent. Or you have the bachelors, who are loud and not violent, but certainly one might implicate violently non-committal. So I think for whatever reason, if you look at other characters, or other writers, I'm sorry, Ernest Hemingway masculinizes, Ernest Hemingway only writes tough guys, even when he's writing women. So a lot of this hard-boiled type, and Maltese Falcon, what was his name? Dashiell Hammett. From my experiences with Dashiell Hammett's writing, I haven't read too much, had much the same problem in only writing the hard-boiled, really masculine man, much like Hemingway did. So George Saunders has a similar problem in that he only writes gender type of neutral characters unless he has to pick some type of caricature seemingly straight out of a Hemingway novel. So it's weird to see. And number 3, with this novel and the way that this novel played out until this novel started playing out differently, the race stuff in this novel feels tacked on and disrespectful to the actual content of what is being talked about. This is... Give me 1 second here, because I think... Yeah, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But this novel feels as if George Saunders got 60% of the way through and realized, ooh, I haven't played any of today's politics into this. I'm not really going to win an award if I don't. Well, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln. We're talking about the Civil War. Let me doll up some of this on, because it doesn't fit in the novel as the novel's narrative unravels. So I don't really know what it was he was going for with that. Quotes, we have 4 of them. And I mean, when I say it feels tacked on in a disrespectful manner, George Saunders does not take any of the time to explicate the characters involved in the racial dynamic of this novel, does not take the time to explore how these characters have interacted. The lieutenant, for example, with, I'm blanking on the name here, the individual Thomas Havens, how these people have interacted during all of our main characters' time in the Bardo. So it feels tacked on in a way that is disrespectful, in that it feels like it is tokenism. It really feels like tokenism. And I hate to throw that around with someone that I revere as much as George Saunders. This quote, the first of 4, comes to us from page 23. Imagine the pain of that, Andrew. To drop one's precious son into that cold stone like some broken bird and be on your way. I think that is just a heartbreaking type of quote. The next quote comes from page 210. Strange, isn't it, to have dedicated one's life to a certain venture, neglecting other aspects of one's life only to have that venture in the end amount to nothing at all, the products of one's labors utterly forgotten. If you are not yet at the point in life where this question is presenting itself to you, Oh, it's a common. What if your life's work is for not? What if your life's work is nothing really? And this is a really interesting way to have that worded out on the page. Strange, isn't it, to have one's life to a certain to have dedicated one's life to a certain venture, neglecting other aspects of one's life, only to have that venture in the end amount to nothing at all, the products of one's labors utterly forgotten. And make no mistake, if you dedicate any part of your life to anything, other parts of your life will suffer. Other parts of your life will be neglected. There are only 24 hours in a day, and if you listen to Arnold Schwarzenegger, you work 8 and you sleep 6, and you might say, well, I need to sleep 8. Just sleep faster, because if you work 8 and sleep 6, you've got 10 left to dedicate to other things, and even then, you are on thin ice as far as spreading that time around. The third quote is from 243, and I got to get to this because the last one is a hefty quote. 243. If there ever really was a Lazarus, there should be nothing preventing conditions that pertained at that time to pertain here and now. Then it was quite something. Mr. Lincoln tried to get the sick form to rise by making his mind quiet and then opening it up to whatever might exist that he did not know about that might be able to make the sick form rise. I thought that was just that's an interesting little moment. Something that I don't think see enough of in literature. Someone who does not have superpowers trying to conjure superpowers in a moment of despair. This last quote is from 303 and 304. His mind was freshly inclined toward sorrow, toward the fact that the world was full of sorrow, that everyone labored under some burden of sorrow, that all were suffering, that whatever way one took in this world, one must try to remember that all were suffering, none content, all wronged, neglected, overlooked, misunderstood. And therefore one must do what one could to lighten the load of those with whom one came into contact. That his current state of sorrow was not uniquely his, not at all, but rather its like had been felt, would be felt by scores of others, in all times, in every time, and must not be prolonged or exaggerated, because in this state he could be of no help to anyone, and given that his position in the world situated him to be either of great help or of great harm, it would not do to stay low if he could help it. I think that's a pretty good place to end that quote, though it goes on a little bit. I think that is a wonderful quote to explore for the necessity of building one's own toughness. You got to wriggle around in your suffering, and you've got to go through it. You've got to be there. It's going to happen. But you want to be there as briefly as possible, because while you're there, you're no good to anyone else. And it is simply selfish to writhe in one's own suffering for too long. Life is suffering. That doesn't mean you have to that doesn't mean you have to be insufferable while you're doing it. Life is suffering. That doesn't mean you have to be insufferable while you're doing it. I like that. Someone write that down. Someone put that in the comments section. I like that. So what are we talking about with the literature in this? The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that this is more just conversational. Why oh, why is the novel situated in the way that the novel is situated? I gave up on the dialogue tags/attributions 30 pages into the novel. At that point, I really didn't care all that much who was talking. I really didn't. When you are looking at Bevins and Volman, so much of their dialogue really sounds the same. To an extent, each one of them has little character quirks about their dialogue that you can sort of tell which one of them is talking or not. Many of the characters in here are identifiable by their dialogue and the types of language that they use, which is damning, again, to George Saunders when it comes to the race stuff. Because every one of these characters has weird little things with their language that makes them identifiable and adds characterization. All of these characters, until the end of the novel, where there's a couple of chapters here where you have characters that are black characters, and there is no dialect to them. Well, why not? It seems harmless enough, but why not is because Saunders seems terrified that if he puts some type of dialect onto that character, it's going to be racist. And maybe it will seem that way. I can't be sure, but it will only really seem that way if it's done ham-fistedly. And that's where Saunders is getting himself in trouble. A lot of the things in the last half of this novel are extremely ham-fisted. And it seemed that he really got himself into trouble in the novel format. Saunders does write short stories, and he writes beautiful short stories, but even his short stories are pretty long. 10th of December, I think, is around 280 pages, and I think it's only 10 short stories. I'm doing this off the top of my head, I might be wrong, but that's averaging 28 pages a short story. So it seems that he laid the roots for this novel in an extremely quirky fashion, and by the time it had grown into a tree and was blossoming the fruit of a literary novel, that fruit was already rotten. Because there are so many little things. Who in this novel gets an ending? I don't mean who in this novel stops existing on the page at a certain point. Who gets an ending? Willie Lincoln's the only one I can think of that gets an actual ending. Reverend Everly Thomas disappears. Bevins and Volman disappear. They're gone by the end of the novel. Lincoln staggers off screen. Manders babbles and meanders. I can't think of any character besides Willie Lincoln that has some actual revelation. There are small revelations with Abraham Lincoln when he decides to leave. There is a small revelation with Reverend Everly Thomas when he decides, well, I'm going to take the kid and bust ass out of here. But that doesn't mean that he gets an ending when he decides to matter light bloom. He just goes. We don't know what happens to him afterwards, and we don't even have the prompting to decide and make that judgment for ourselves. We don't even have the prompting to do that, let alone do we have any real reason to believe we understand whether he goes to heaven or hell when he revisits that place of judgment. So that's that. Number two, along these lines, Why in the blue hell are Bevins and Volman our main characters? We know Bevins and Volman way before we are introduced to Everly Thomas. They are around after Thomas is gone. They predate Willie Lincoln in the novel. They're around after he's gone, though we do not end with either of these characters. I think that it is only fair to make these two characters out to be our main characters. I don't think that it is fair to assume anyone else is the main character of this novel. Because of, if for no other reason, the quote-unquote screen time dedicated to each of these individuals. We get both of their backstories. We get both of their demises. We get both of their madder light blooms. With that said, because of that, I have to assume they're our main characters. No character in here really fits the bill of a main character, which is fine. You don't have to, but if you don't have a main character, it's going to affect the reading of the novel. But why are these characters our main characters? I don't have an answer. Nothing necessitates these characters in the reading of the novel. In fact, if you wanted, so there's a quote from Neil Gaiman that says, "A second draft makes it look like you knew what you were doing the whole time." If he decided to go back and really necessitate his main character in a way that implicated the racial tensions at the end of the novel, why not have Haven as your main character? And then when Haven ends up entering Abraham Lincoln in the way that Volman and Bevins do, and he sees what it is that this man is trying to get done, and all of the things, all of the suffering that is happening in the meanwhile, that becomes a point of contention in the book. That becomes a revelation that is indelible to Havens. That becomes a point where the caricature and the characterization blend, where they become one. Instead, we have Bevins and Volman, who aren't bad characters by any means. I think you get to like them as the book goes on. But at any point, we could have taken any of these other characters and been absolutely fine in the narrative. And thematically, had we chosen someone like Havens to introduce early and follow through the novel, our themes would have been necessitated. Moving on from that, we've got the idea of Willie Lincoln. Willie Lincoln is so much like Abraham. And on page 280, we have this little bit. Wow, I'm turning way too few pages at a time here. Willie is so much like Abraham. And we have this moment when Willie goes to visit Abraham in the chapel. Seated one inside the other now, they occupied the same physical space, the child a contained version of the man. This is on the precipice of Willie Lincoln deciding, through the narrative of his father, not only that, yeah, no, okay, I'm dead, but B, so are all of you, and none of you ought to be here. Scram. What are you doing? You're wasting your time. Get out of here. Matter light bloom. This is right on the edge of that. So it is said, there's a saying out there, people talk about it, that the moment we really become an adult is the day that we look around and we realize none of these other people, none of these other jokers running around know a goddamn thing more about this than do I. That's an old saying. And this is a moment that sort of really authors that sort of really offers it to the reader. In the end, it is Willie Lincoln who declares, quote unquote, "We are dead." Willie is the young Abe. Abe not only was aware of mortality at a young age, we described that through some of Lincoln's melancholy as we took on this novel, but he also ended up becoming the great emancipator, and Willie is, in the end, the emancipator of so many of the spirits that were trapped by themselves in the Bardo at this time, because they were unwilling to realize and recognize these certain things about themselves. Willie prompted them into it. So that is a nice little moment there. Next to last thing I've got to talk about really plays off of that. We have the reversal of two major literary tropes in this novel. And reversals or unexpected things is something that you can really always count on George Saunders to deliver. But here what we have is a young character who projects themselves into the death of an older character, not an old character who we have a young character who projects themselves onto the death of an older character, not an old character who refines himself in the death of a younger character. We have, I think it's backwards. I did that wrong. We have an older character who refines himself through the death of a young character, not a younger character who looks at an older character and recognizes, I'm going to be that guy. Oftentimes, I think in romantic comedies, you have the not good looking guy who really has to work hard to get with the girl, and at some point during this movie, he meets a bitter older man and recognizes, I'm on that path, Here, instead of that, we have an older character, Abraham Lincoln, who looks at the death of his son and recognizes himself in his son, and because of that, finds the strength to keep evolving. Another reversal of a trope that we have. So this novel takes place during the Civil War and shortly before the assassination of a president. Oftentimes, when a novel is written around large real-world events, what you have is you will have a scene of the big thing that then follows a character through it into a personal story. So, for example, I can't think of any examples. You have... No, because Slaughterhouse-Five sort of starts in a weird way. But oftentimes with war stories, right, you have a big depiction of a battle. Somewhere in that battle and melee, we find a protagonist. We follow him down into the trenches, if it's World War I, deep in the trenches, with bullets zinging overhead. He finds himself on the front lines by reciting one of Shakespeare's sonnets, a good English story, And then we understand that, well, both his mother and his father were school teachers. So that's why the poem itself is important to him. Yada, 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 right? You have the big thing, which then winds down into a personalized story. Here, we're starting, instead of that way, we're starting with the personalized story, which I thought was really, really interesting. Because you don't ever really get that. When you talk about Abraham Lincoln, you talk about the Civil War, you talk about the end of slavery, you talk about assassination, you talk about all of these things which lead to the fact that he is one of the most revered presidents of all time, and he seemed to be such a conflicted individual on top of it all. Instead, what we have is this very personal story about Abraham Lincoln losing a son. And by the time we get to the end, instead of zooming in to find a personalized story, we have a funnel which pushes us. We have a reverse funnel. We're going into the small end of the funnel and out into the big world. We have a personalized story which ends up leading us out into a narrative about the Civil War and the end of slavery. The last thing I want to talk about before giving a rating and a recommendation based on the text, Bardo. Why? Why Bardo? I wasn't able to ever find an actual conclusion as to why it was that George Saunders decided to use the term Bardo instead of limbo. Because at the end of Limbo, we have a scene. The Reverend has been there. It's an extremely Judeo-Christian scene. It is perhaps even an Egyptian type scene, but whatever it is, it's from the it's Western. I mean, you're thinking of Egypt as Western. You're thinking of Judeo-Christian as Western. In fact, Egypt is more Western than Judeo part of Judeo-Christian. So why, oh why, are we titling this Lincoln and the Bardo, if not just to be weird? Like I say, at the end of it, we get a very Christian scene. We get a very Judeo-Christian scene of the heart being weighed, and then you get to go to either heaven or hell. And I think that this is another shortcoming of the novel. I really do. Hey, maybe I missed it. The Bardo and Tibetan philosophy is not something with which I am all that versed. Maybe it's extremely obvious here what's actually going on. I never got there. It feels to me like something which was chosen haphazardly, and Saunders either A, thought, oh yeah, that sounds great, or B, by the end of the novel, I'll smooth it over. I got this idea for a good title. I'll smooth it over along the way. We'll get there. Either way, I don't get it. Rating and recommendation based on the text, I would give this 80 Matter Light Blooms. I can't say it. It's a nonsensical phrase. God damn you, George Saunders. I'm angry. I would give this 80 Matter Light Blooms out of 100. It was definitely worth reading. It is definitely something that will test your adherence to the canon, maybe. Your adherence to those things which are conventional. And in that way, if for no other reason than just stretching out, I think it's a great thing to read. Just to loosen yourself. It's like a we want to go back to Eastern things. It's like a yoga class for your readerhood. What would I recommend based on the text? Number one, if you enjoyed this, you really got to read 10th of December. That is the short story collection from George Saunders, which I believe immediately preceded his novel. It came out in 2013, I believe. Great short stories through that. I've got a review for, I think, all of those short stories except for the very final one here on the channel. Or, if you wanted, you could read Lincoln's Melancholy, because you have a very similar picture of Lincoln in this biography as you do in the novel. So that is all I have for this, the conclusion to Lincoln in the Bardo. I hope to see you back for the next read-along that we have here on the channel. And don't forget that on the playlists tab here on the channel, there are all of the books that I've done a read-along for, so there might be something else there to catch your fancy.